In 1997, Apple was on the brink of collapse. It's hard to imagine now, but the company that once symbolized innovation and hope was days away from death. Customers had lost faith, employees were demoralized, and the halls of Apple's headquarters felt like a ghost town. Some employees quietly began packing their belongings, fearing the company's collapse was imminent. Loyal customers, the ones who had stuck with Apple through thick and thin, were losing hope. For a company that had once been on top of the world, it was a terrifying fall from grace. How had it come to this? And at that darkest hour, the man who had started it all, the visionary who co-founded Apple in a garage, was nowhere to be seen. Steve Jobs was gone, exiled from the empire he built over a decade before, and the soul of Apple seemed to have left with him. Years earlier, Steve had been the heart of Apple. He poured his passion, creativity, and relentless energy into it. In his early 20s, he and his friend Steve Wozniak built the Apple II, one of the first personal computers to captivate the world. By 1984, he unveiled the Macintosh with a famed Super Bowl commercial, announcing to everyone that computing would never be the same. He had turned a wild idea from a garage into a revolution in personal computing. Apple wasn't just a company to Steve, it was a piece of his soul, as dear to him as family. But genius often comes with a fiery temper and an uncompromising vision, and Steve's intensity made him as many enemies as admirers. By 1985, a power struggle at the top of Apple pushed Steve out. The CEO he had brought in to help guide the company, a man Steve had once admired, had sided with the board to remove him. Steve could still picture the boardroom on that fateful day, the long polished table, the air thick with tension. One by one, the board members told him they had lost confidence in his leadership. They talked about needing professional management and making tough choices. As their words sank in, Steve felt as though the floor was opening up beneath him. This couldn't be real. He was being exiled from his own company. He was only 30 years old and he was fired from the very company he had built from nothing. That day felt like a nightmare. One moment he was Apple's prodigy, the bold co-founder who dared to challenge the giants of the industry. The next, he was cast aside, stripped of power, forced out of the company he loved more than anything. Steve walked out of Apple's doors devastated, his life's work ripped away. As he stepped into the warm California sun in the parking lot, clutching a cardboard box of his office belongings, the afternoon sun was blindingly bright, in stark contrast to the darkness he felt inside. His mind swirled, full of disbelief and hurt. He felt anger, humiliation, and heartbreak all at once. A few colleagues stood by, watching silently, some couldn't even meet his eyes. Steve tried to hold his head high as he left, but his legs felt like lead. It was as if the ground had dropped out from under him, as if a part of his very identity had been erased. Late that night, long after the boardroom showdown, Steve sat alone in his home, surrounded by the boxes he had brought from his office. The silence was deafening. In the dark, he replayed the events again and again, the tense meeting in the boardroom, the stunned look on his face when they told him, the feeling of betrayal as colleagues he once trusted turned against him, the finality of the board's decision. He knew that by morning, the news of his ouster would be all over Silicon Valley. The radio and TV would be talking about how Steve Jobs lost his touch, or was no longer needed at the company he started. As he sat in silence, another memory came unbidden. Just a year earlier, he had been standing on a stage unveiling the Macintosh, with a crowd cheering and chanting his name. He could still see it, the auditorium lights, the thrill when the Mac's computer-generated voice said, "Hello," to the world, the applause that rang in his ears. He remembered the grin on his face that day, how he believed it was just the beginning of even greater things. Now it felt like that happened to someone else, in another lifetime. How had it all crumbled so quickly? Steve's phone began to ring, reporters seeking a comment on the shocking downfall of Apple's Wonder Boy, but he ignored it. He had no words to explain what happened. Not tonight. He wasn't ready to face the world. For the first time, he felt truly alone. Broken. Betrayed. Without Apple, he felt lost. The purpose that had fueled his life was gone. Tears burned his eyes as he stared at the floor, trying to process the impossible. Apple, his child, his dream, was gone from his life. And without it, Steve felt like he had lost his purpose. Yet even in that despair, a small voice inside him refused to be silenced. Many people might have given up right then and there, letting the bitterness of failure consume them. And who could blame them? But Steve wasn't built that way. Deep down, he believed that this couldn't be the end of his story. This wasn't the end, the voice insisted. Steve was hurt, but deep down a spark still flickered, the same spark that had driven him to create Apple in the first place. He realized he had a choice. He could either let this heartbreak define him, or he could fight back and start anew. With trembling hands, Steve wiped his tears and took a deep breath. He made a promise to himself. This is not how my story ends, he told himself. He might have been out of Apple, but he wasn't going to give up on his passion. The only way to do great work is to love what you do, he reminded himself, echoing a belief that had always lived in him. If he loved Apple's mission, he could carry that mission forward even if it had to be somewhere else. So Steve made up his mind that night. He would not fade away. He would not let the world or a group of executives write his final chapter. He was down, but not out. In the months and years that followed, he threw himself into new ventures with fierce determination. The pain of losing Apple became the fuel for his comeback. Steve started a new computer company called Next, a bold attempt to rediscover the magic he had lost. He poured much of his own money and heart into it, assembling a team of brilliant engineers and setting out to create a computer system years ahead of its time. Next built machines and software that were innovative and elegant, and Steve approached this new project with the same passion he had for the Macintosh. But the world was different now. The glory days of Apple were a tough act to follow, and Next struggled to break into a market dominated by giants. The computers were too expensive for mainstream consumers and sold only to niche corners of education and research. As the years passed, Next never achieved the runaway success Apple had seen in its heyday. There were moments of triumph, a clever piece of software, praise from tech insiders, but also many moments of crushing disappointment. Steve persevered, pouring every ounce of creativity and vision into Next, desperately searching for redemption and a second chance. Still, in the quiet of night after a long day, Steve sometimes wondered if his best years were behind him. Was he a has-been? Had he lost the magic touch that made Apple great? Those doubts could have paralyzed him, but instead they fueled him to work even harder, to prove, if only to himself, that he still had greatness within him. He kept pushing forward, determined that one day he would connect with the future he imagined. And indeed, there were bright spots along the way. Not everything in Steve's life was bleak after Apple. Even as Next struggled to break through, another venture of his was quietly succeeding beyond his wildest dreams. Steve had acquired a small computer animation studio called Pixar, and he nurtured it with the same care he gave to his tech projects. In 1995, Pixar released Toy Story, the first ever feature-length computer-animated film. It was a bold gamble, a crazy idea in an industry dominated by hand-drawn animation. Many in Hollywood doubted that a digital cartoon could captivate audiences. On the night of the Toy Story premiere, Steve sat among a crowd of families, children, and film executives, his heart pounding with anticipation. As the credits rolled, the theater erupted in applause and delighted laughter. Steve found himself wiping away tears of joy. This was pure magic, a story brought to life with technology and imagination. Toy Story was an instant blockbuster, touching the hearts of millions and forever changing the film industry. Overnight, Pixar became a powerhouse in Hollywood. The press that once described Steve as a fallen tech prodigy now hailed him as a visionary in entertainment. For the first time in years, Steve tasted a genuine victory. It wasn't in personal computers, but it was still the realm of innovation and creativity, and it reminded him of who he truly was at his core. The success of Pixar gave Steve renewed confidence, proof that his genius and drive had not died with his exit from Apple. It also taught him something new. Watching artists and technologists work together on films taught Steve the value of collaboration and patience in a way he hadn't experienced in the fast-paced computer industry. Making a movie took years of painstaking teamwork, iteration, and trust in others' talents. Steve absorbed these lessons quietly. He would carry them back with him to Apple when the time came. He realized he could still dream, still innovate, still change the world even if it was in a completely different arena. During those years away from Apple, Steve also found personal happiness. He married the love of his life, Laureen, and started a family. Becoming a husband and father brought him joy and perspective outside of work, softening some of his sharp edges and reminding him that there was more at stake than just business. This new sense of maturity quietly influenced him, even if the fire of ambition still burned as hot as ever. But even amidst the Pixar triumph and personal growth, Apple's shadow loomed large in Steve's mind. While Steve fought to rebuild his dreams, the company he left behind struggled to find its soul. Apple without Steve was like a ship without its captain, drifting in a storm. In the late 1980s and early 90s, Apple released product after product, but something was missing. The spark was gone. The vision blurred. Each new machine or gadget felt more like a desperate attempt to catch up than a bold leap forward. The world, it seemed, had moved on without Apple. Microsoft dominated the industry with its Windows software, making billions and seemingly owning the future. Apple's innovations, once the gold standard, were now seen as niche, expensive, even irrelevant. Inside Apple's headquarters, morale was sinking. CEOs came and went like passengers on a sinking ship, one leadership change after another, but nothing could stop the slide. One CEO tried to spark a revival by launching a futuristic handheld device, the Newton, but it was too ahead of its time and failed to catch on. Another attempted to license Apple's software to other computer makers, hoping to clone the Mac's success, but that only confused customers and eroded Apple's uniqueness. Every strategy seemed to backfire. Apple's profits turned to losses, its market share crumbled. Industry pundits began writing Apple's obituary. Magazines printed headlines like, "Apple's lost magic," and "The end of Apple." By 1996, the proud company was on the verge of bankruptcy, its stock at historic lows, its future uncertain. In Cupertino, Apple's hometown, coffee shop chatter among employees turned into hushed discussions of, "What will we do if Apple shuts down?" It was almost unthinkable, yet it felt increasingly likely. Longtime Apple engineers watched friends at other tech companies thrive while their own careers hung in limbo. Some joked darkly that Apple's new slogan should be, "Think frightened." Steve watched all this from a distance, with a heavy heart. Even after all the pain of being pushed out, he never stopped caring about Apple. How could he? Apple was like his child, and to see it floundering was agony. He tried to focus on building something new from the ashes of his past, but every news report about Apple's decline was like a dagger in his heart. Friends and colleagues would gingerly ask him what he thought about Apple's troubles, but Steve usually bit his tongue. It was too painful to discuss. He tried to bury himself in his new work, but he could not escape the constant reminders of Apple's woes. He remembered walking into a store one day and seeing an Apple computer collecting dust in the corner, while shiny new PCs running Windows stole the spotlight. It hurt. Not out of pride or ego, but because he knew Apple still had so much potential, so much creativity left to give to the world. It was as if the world had forgotten the dream he once sold them. Computers could be beautiful, intuitive, even magical, but without Apple's guidance, that dream was fading. Loyal Apple customers felt it too. The brand that had inspired so much passion was losing its shine. Many declared Apple was already dead, that it just hadn't realized it yet. And then, just when things were darkest, fate came knocking at Steve's door, quite literally. As 1996 turned into 1997, Apple, desperate and on the brink of collapse, needed help. The company had tried everything, slashing costs, churning out random new products, even hunting for a merger or a savior, but nothing stopped its downward spiral. In a last-ditch move, Apple's leadership made a bold, ironic decision. They would buy Next, Steve's new company, to acquire its advanced software, and with it, bring Steve Jobs himself back into the fold as an advisor. The prodigal son was being asked to return home to the very home that had cast him out. Steve's phone rang, and on the line was an Apple executive with an offer. Apple wanted Next Software to build a new foundation for its operating system, and they were willing to pay millions for it. More importantly, they wanted Steve back, at least in an advisory role. When Steve hung up the phone, he sat quietly for a long moment, heart pounding. This was the moment he had secretly dreamed of, and also the moment he feared. He had built a new life after Apple. Was he really ready to go back? The Apple he knew was gone, replaced by a company in crisis, full of people who might resent his return. And the people who had betrayed him, some of them were still there. Could he forgive? Could he swallow his pride for the sake of saving the company he loved? To clear his head, Steve went for a walk through the quiet Palo Alto streets as dusk settled in, the sky streaked with purple and gold. Memories flooded him, the scrappy excitement of the garage days, the roar of the crowd when the Macintosh was unveiled, the sting of that bitter day he was cast out. Now fate was offering him a second chance, but could he really take it? Doubts and hopes dueled in his mind. What if he went back and failed? Would he lose Apple all over again, this time for good? But then another thought came. What if this was the moment he was meant for? What if everything, the triumphs and the pain, had led to this opportunity to save the very thing he loved? As he walked under the gentle glow of streetlights, Steve realized something deep and profound. This wasn't just about Apple's survival, it was about finishing his own unfinished story. It felt as if life had arranged a path for him to come full circle, to redeem both Apple and himself. Standing under the evening sky, he looked up at the first few stars appearing and felt that familiar determination welling up inside. It was time to go home. Steve Jobs decided to return to Apple. When he walked back through Apple's doors in 1997, it wasn't with any triumphant parade or guaranteed success. It was a humble homecoming to a place that was almost unrecognizable. On his first morning back, he drove up to Apple's campus in Cupertino, passing the sign with the iconic rainbow-colored Apple logo, faded and sun-bleached after years of neglect. His hands tightened on the steering wheel as he parked. The parking lot had plenty of empty spaces, and the building seemed strangely quiet. Stepping out of his car, he took a deep breath, feeling both excitement and anxiety. He was coming back to Wreckage, a company nearly out of cash, maybe only a few months away from shutting its doors, and a team of people who were exhausted and skeptical. Inside, employees gathered to see the returning co-founder. Standing there, in the lobby of Apple's campus, Steve felt a swell of emotion. A few older employees who had been around in the early days approached him and shook his hand. "Welcome home, Steve," one of them said softly, eyes brimming with gratitude and hope. Steve smiled humbly. He could sense the mix of desperation and expectation in their faces. He looked around at the crowd of Apple staff, some veterans who remembered the glory days, many others who only knew him as a legend or a myth. He could see the uncertainty in their eyes, a mixture of relief, curiosity, and doubt. To them, Steve was a legend, yes, but legends don't always translate into real-world saviors. Apple had been failing for so long that many had lost hope that anyone, even Steve Jobs, could truly turn it around. Steve gathered everyone's attention with a clap of his hands. With no podium or script, he spoke to them from the heart, candid, passionate, and unfiltered. He acknowledged the pain and struggle Apple had been through. He didn't sugarcoat it. Apple was in deep trouble, and mistakes had been made. "We've had some hard years," he admitted openly, his voice echoing in the atrium. "We've made mistakes, I've made mistakes. But it's not too late to turn this around." He didn't shy away from the truth that they had lost their way. Then his tone shifted from admitting faults to igniting passion, from regret to resolve. "We've got to get the spark back," he declared, his eyes shining with conviction. There was a hush as everyone hung on to his words. Steve reminded them of who Apple really was. He spoke of why he had co-founded the company in the first place, to empower the little guy, to bring technology to the masses, to change the world. He reminded them of Apple's founding spirit, how they set out to put a dent in the universe and to prove that people with passion could change the world for the better. "The core values of Apple haven't changed," he said, his voice steady and clear. "Not one bit. We just lost sight of them. But we, all of us here, are still the dreamers, the pioneers. We're the guys who made the Macintosh when everyone said it couldn't be done. That spirit lives here. We just have to remember it." He looked around the room, making eye contact with as many people as he could. "It will not be easy," Steve warned. He promised them no quick fixes or magic bullets. "We have a lot of hard work ahead, and some tough decisions to make," he said. But then he smiled that familiar mischievous smile. "I know we can do it. I know you can do it. Because I've seen what this company is capable of, and it is amazing." As Steve spoke, a quiet determination began to replace the doubt on many employees' faces. Heads began to nod around the room, some eyes welled with tears, others sparked with a new fire. People exchanged glances that said, "Maybe this can work." They could feel it, the spark was coming back. For the first time in a long time, there was a palpable sense of hope in Apple's halls. The battle to save Apple had truly begun. Steve threw himself into the work with almost superhuman intensity. Officially, he took the title of interim CEO, ICEO, as he jokingly called himself, and even opted to take a token salary of just $1. It wasn't about money, it was about redemption. There was nothing temporary about his commitment. He was back in his element, spending long days and late nights poring over product plans, scrutinizing designs, and brainstorming marketing strategies. More than once, he slept on the couch in his office, too exhausted to drive home. Apple's situation was dire, and Steve attacked it with urgency. There was no time to waste and no room for error. In those first weeks, he immediately began making the tough calls. He slashed Apple's product lineup, cutting everything that wasn't essential. His philosophy was simple: focus. Apple had spread itself too thin, trying to be everything to everyone, and in the process, it had lost its identity. Steve knew that focus meant saying no to 100 good ideas so that you can wholeheartedly pursue one great one. Apple had to stop doing so much and start doing what mattered. So he cleared the slate. He drew a simple chart on a whiteboard, 2 rows, 2 columns, and in each quadrant he wrote the name of a product that Apple would make. 4 products in total: 1 desktop computer and 1 laptop for consumers, 1 desktop and 1 laptop for professionals. Everything else was gone. It was a drastic reduction, but it brought clarity. Every resource the company had left would be poured into making those 4 products exceptional. It was a bold gamble, cutting back in order to move forward, but Apple needed focus or it would surely die. Not everyone agreed with his decisions. Engineers who had spent years on projects saw them summarily cancelled. Inside Apple, some whispered that Steve was being reckless, that he was throwing away valuable work and betraying teams who had given their all. Rumors swirled that he was out of touch or simply settling old scores. But Steve's conviction was unshakable. He knew that Apple's only chance was to remember how to think different again, to rediscover the bold spirit of innovation that had made it great, and he was prepared to do whatever it took. One of the hardest moments came when Steve decided to make peace with an old enemy for the sake of Apple's future. Apple's rivalry with Microsoft was the stuff of legend, and since Steve's departure, Microsoft had become the most powerful tech company on Earth. Many at Apple, and among its devoted fans, viewed Microsoft as the villain that had vanquished Apple. But Steve saw a hard truth: for Apple to survive, it couldn't afford a war, it needed allies. So, at a major industry conference in 1997, Steve walked on stage and did the unthinkable. He announced a partnership with Microsoft. The rival would invest $150 million in Apple and commit to developing core software like Microsoft Office for the Mac. As he spoke, Microsoft's CEO, Bill Gates, even appeared live on a huge screen above the stage via satellite feed, looming over Steve's shoulder like a specter. The sight of Gates addressing the Apple faithful was surreal, a reminder of just how much the tables had turned. At first, A chorus of gasps, and then boos, rose from die-hard Apple fans in the audience. To the faithful, making a deal with Microsoft felt like betrayal. Some booed loudly, their faces twisted in anger and disbelief. Steve stood there, calm and resolute, even as the boos echoed. It wasn't easy enduring that reaction. Apple loyalists had been through a lot, but he knew this was the medicine Apple needed. We have to let go of the notion that for Apple to win, Microsoft has to lose, he explained firmly over the jeers, his voice resolute. We have to embrace the notion that for Apple to survive, we have to do what's right for Apple. Slowly, the booing subsided as his words sank in. It was a tough pill to swallow for many in the crowd and even for Steve himself, but it was the right move. That infusion of cash and the promise of continued Microsoft software support bought Apple precious time that Steve would use wisely. As engineers toiled to create great products, Steve also knew Apple needed to reignite the public's imagination. The company had to remind the world, and itself, what Apple stood for. So in the fall of 1997, Apple launched a bold new slogan, "Think Different." The advertising campaign featured iconic black and white images of Einstein, Martin Luther King Jr., John Lennon, Amelia Earhart, and other visionaries and rebels. A narrator proclaimed, "Here's to the crazy ones, the misfits, the rebels, the troublemakers, the round pegs in the square holes, celebrating those who see the world differently." The ad concluded that while some may see them as crazy, we see genius, because the people who are crazy enough to think they can change the world are the ones who do. It was Apple's message to the world and to itself. This campaign was a rallying cry, a beacon of what Apple had always stood for, the courage to challenge the status quo. It signaled that Apple's soul was still alive. The Think Different campaign reignited pride among Apple's employees and loyal customers, even as the company was still finding its footing. It set the stage for the tangible changes to come. With a leaner team, a clearer vision, and a little more money in the bank, Apple was ready to fight for its life. Steve didn't waste a second of that precious time. With the cultural spark lit, Apple got to work creating something new, a product that would show the world that Apple was still very much alive and kicking. Steve had a vision for the first new computer of Apple's rebirth, a machine that would remind people of Apple's soul. He imagined a computer not just powerful and useful, but also beautiful and fun, something that would make people's eyes light up when they saw it. That product would become the iMac. The development of the iMac was a whirlwind. Designers and engineers worked feverishly, inspired, and pushed, by Steve's energy and attention to detail. Steve was involved in every aspect of the design. He wanted the iMac to look unlike any other computer. He insisted it should be playful, friendly, and approachable, with a touch of whimsy. He famously said he wanted it to be so appealing that you'd want to lick it. He chose a bold translucent Bondi blue shell for the computer, so you could literally see the creativity inside. He even added a handle on the top of the iMac, as if to say, "Take me home." The message was clear, this machine was meant for ordinary people, not just techies. Steve also obsessed over the user experience. He demanded that setting up and using the iMac be so simple that a child could do it. The team worked around the clock. Long days blurred into sleepless nights as Apple's engineers and designers poured their hearts into bringing Steve's vision to life. There were countless moments of frustration, prototypes that overheated or didn't look right, technical challenges that seemed insurmountable, but Steve kept everyone focused. When exhaustion set in, he would paint a picture of the future they were creating, a world where Apple was innovative again, where customers were thrilled by their computers, where the press stopped talking about Apple's impending death and started talking about its bold new ideas. It was as if he were leading a campaign, and morale, despite the fatigue, was building. Steve drove his team hard, his standards were exacting, but he also inspired them. He had an uncanny ability to make people believe that they weren't just building a product, they were fighting for a dream. Engineers who were used to being ignored at the old Apple suddenly found the CEO sitting with them, debating circuit board layouts or the aesthetics of an air vent. Steve pushed, prodded, and encouraged, refusing to settle for good enough, at a time when merely good might not save the company. One late night, an engineer came to Steve with yet another technical obstacle, despairing that what Steve wanted might be impossible. Steve put a hand on his shoulder and said quietly, "Don't be afraid. We can do this. You can do this." That simple encouragement from Steve, a man known for expecting the impossible, was enough to steel the engineer's resolve. They'd solved this problem, just like they'd solved all the others. They had to. And they did. In the summer of 1998, less than a year after Steve's return, the new Apple was finally ready to show the world its first creation. The venue was the Flint Center, the very same auditorium where, back in 1984, youthful Steve Jobs had unveiled the original Macintosh to thunderous applause. Now, 14 years later, he stood backstage in that hall once again, older and a bit battle-scarred, feeling a profound sense of déjà vu. He remembered that day in '84 vividly, the nerves, the electric excitement, the hope in the air. Today, the stakes were even higher. So much had changed in his life and in Apple, yet here he was, about to attempt to catch lightning in a bottle a second time. Steve took a deep breath as the crowd of journalists, industry watchers, and loyal Apple fans settled into their seats. The lights dimmed, and he walked onto the stage wearing his trademark black turtleneck, jeans, and a determined smile. He began to speak, telling the audience about Apple's journey, its challenges, its soul, and its mission to bring creativity and technology together. There was tension in the air, a mix of hope and skepticism. Many in the audience had written Apple off as a thing of the past. They weren't sure what to expect now. Then, with a theatrical flourish, Steve revealed the new iMac. The curtain lifted and there it was, shining under the stage lights, a striking all-in-one computer in a translucent Bondi blue casing, like nothing ever seen before. It looked like a computer from the future, friendly, colorful, and inviting. Sitting next to the boring beige PC boxes that filled store shelves at the time, the iMac was like a piece of candy in a bowl of vegetables. It beckoned you to come closer, to play and explore. For a moment, the audience was silent, taking in this bold machine. Then the crowd let out a collective gasp, followed by thunderous applause. People jumped to their feet. The auditorium erupted. Some exchanged astonished grins, others looked up at the stage in disbelief, as if witnessing a minor miracle. The excitement in the room was electric. This wasn't a company's death knell, it was a rebirth. After the presentation, people rushed toward the stage to get a closer look at the iMac, chattering excitedly. The buzz was beyond anything Apple had seen in years. The reviews of the iMac were glowing. Suddenly, magazines that had been preparing Apple's obituary were featuring the colorful new machine on their covers with headlines like, "Apple's Big Bounce." The iMac became a symbol of Apple's fresh start. Customers flocked to buy it, drawn by its friendly setup and playful, modern design. It sold in the millions, injecting much-needed revenue into Apple's coffers and, more importantly, restoring faith in the brand. By the end of that year, Apple was profitable again for the first time in years. That fall, as the first iMacs shipped out to delighted customers around the world, Steve walked through Apple's offices and saw something he hadn't seen in a long time. People were smiling. There was pride again among the teams, a sense that they were part of something special. The company once derided as a has-been was now being called a comeback kid. Apple was no longer the butt of industry jokes or a sad story of missed opportunities, it was a phoenix rising from the ashes. And Steve, who not long ago had been a pariah in these halls, was hailed as the savior. It was a surreal and deeply emotional experience for him. Late one night, long after most employees had gone home, Steve sat down at his desk, an iMac casting a soft glow in the darkened office, and allowed himself a moment to reflect. The very computer in front of him embodied a miracle. Just a year ago, Apple was nearly dead, only weeks from bankruptcy, and now the iMac's success had given it a new lease on life. He remembered the promise he made to himself on the night he was fired, that his story would not end in defeat. That promise had carried him through so many dark days, and it had been fulfilled in this very moment. If he had given up back then, if he had lost faith in himself or in the spirit of Apple, none of this would have happened. This was vindication, not in a boastful way, but as a quiet affirmation that believing in himself and holding onto his vision had been the right choice. There was still a long road ahead. One product wasn't enough to declare total victory. Apple was just finding its footing again. But the trajectory had changed. The darkest night had passed, the first rays of dawn were breaking. Apple had survived the night, and a new day was beginning. He looked at the iMac's glowing logo and exhaled. He felt gratitude for the second chance, for the team that had made this comeback possible, for the customers who hadn't given up on Apple. He felt a renewed sense of purpose. He realized the very heartbreak that had once nearly destroyed him had led to this moment of triumph. The universe truly worked in mysterious ways. If there was one thing Steve knew, it was that perseverance and passion had saved Apple and had saved him. The comeback story didn't end with one successful computer. Steve wasn't about to let Apple become complacent. The iMac was just the beginning. Over the next few years, he pushed Apple to venture into new territories and revolutionize other industries, all in the spirit of Think Different. True to that motto, Apple began releasing products that nobody expected, products that, in time, became cultural icons. The late 90s rolled into the 2000s, and Steve and Apple kept building momentum. They refined the iMac, introducing it in a range of vibrant colors that made it a fashion statement as much as a computer. They launched the iBook, a sleek, clamshell laptop in bright hues, bringing a youthful energy to portable computing. Step by step, Apple was rebuilding its reputation. The tech press stopped asking, "Will Apple survive?" and began asking, "What will Apple do next?" In 2001, Steve took another bold leap. On an October day in 2001, he stood on a stage and unveiled a device that would once again surprise the world, the iPod. For Steve, a lifelong music lover who revered Bob Dylan and the Beatles, this product was deeply personal. He wanted to merge his love of music with technology in a way that would transform people's lives. He held up a sleek white gadget about the size of a deck of cards and, with a sly grin, said, "Say hello to iPod. 1,000 songs in your pocket." In a world still used to carrying around CD players or clunky cassette Walkmans, the idea of having 1,000 songs in your pocket felt almost magical. At first, some were skeptical. Apple was a computer company. What were they doing making music players? But Steve had a vision far beyond just selling a gadget. He was about to change the entire music industry. The iPod, combined with Apple's iTunes software and new iTunes online store, transformed the way people discover and listen to music. No longer did you need shelves full of CDs, now your favorite songs traveled with you everywhere, effortlessly. You could have your music with you on a morning run, on the commute, or when you needed that one special song to lift your spirits. To Steve, this was not just about convenience, it was about the intersection of technology and art, about giving people the soundtrack to their lives whenever they wanted it. The iPod wasn't just successful, it was a phenomenon. Suddenly, white earbud headphones dangled from ears on streets across the world, a global symbol of innovation and cool. Apple went from the brink of obscurity to suddenly defining the culture of the digital age. It wasn't just a tech company anymore, it was a trendsetter. The iPod became the must-have device. It put an entire music library in your pocket, and in doing so, it gave people around the globe a new kind of joy. Apple's music revolution also saved a faltering music industry by offering a legal, easy way to buy songs digitally. Steve could not have been prouder. He often thought back to the early days in his parents' garage, when he and Woz would crank up Bob Dylan as they soldered circuits late into the night. Music had always been a source of inspiration and comfort for him. And now, through technology, he was giving that gift of music to millions. It was not just about bytes and circuits, it was about emotion, about humanity. And the world responded. Apple became cool again, truly cool, in a way it had never been before. Teenagers, college students, executives, even people who had never owned a computer were buying iPods and dancing down the street with those white earbuds. Apple was leading a digital music revolution, and Steve was at the helm, grinning like a kid who'd just pulled off the greatest magic trick. But Steve was never one to rest on his laurels. Even as the iPod dominated the market and brought Apple to new heights of profitability and cultural prominence, he was already looking to the future. He constantly asked his team, "What's next?" One thing gnawed at him: the mobile phone. Mobile phones in the early 2000s were clunky, utilitarian devices, plastic buttons, tiny screens, awkward software. People tolerated their phones, few actually loved them. To Steve, this represented an enormous opportunity. What if Apple could reinvent the phone the way it had the computer and the music player? It sounded far-fetched, even some of his own team wondered if it was a bridge too far. Making a phone was an entirely new challenge with huge incumbents in the field. But Steve envisioned a device that would essentially put a powerful computer, digital hub, in everyone's pocket, combining a phone, a music player, and an internet communicator all in one, and make it simple. He wanted to create a phone that people would truly love, something beautiful and intuitive, something that would redefine what a phone could be. And so began the most ambitious product development in Apple's history, the project that would eventually become the iPhone. The work was intense and shrouded in absolute secrecy. Steve handpicked the best engineers and designers in the company and swore them to silence. They operated like a startup within Apple, with Jobs as the hands-on leader. What they were attempting had never been done. There were enormous technical hurdles: designing a large multi-touch display that was responsive and durable, creating a new operating system that was powerful yet easy to use with fingers, figuring out how to cram a computer's guts into a slim phone body, and hundreds of other challenges. The team pushed themselves to the limit. There were nights when key engineers didn't go home at all. They slept under their desks or on office couches, grabbing a few hours of rest before diving back into the work. One late night, an engineer trudged into Steve's office and, in frustration, said, "This just isn't possible." The touchscreen was laggy, the battery life was poor, there were too many issues. Steve, who was bone-tired himself, looked at the engineer with unwavering eyes. He placed a hand on his shoulder and said quietly but firmly, "Don't be afraid. We will do this. We're going to make something that people don't even know they need yet, but once they have it, they won't be able to imagine life without it." That simple statement, brimming with confidence and vision, galvanized the team. It was exactly what Steve had been doing all along, making the impossible possible, one hard decision at a time. Apple's culture of relentless innovation kicked into high gear. Good enough was not enough, they had to build something insanely great. Each time they solved one problem, Steve pushed them to tackle the next. Slowly but surely, the pieces began to come together. The breakthrough multi-touch interface, the elegant software, the sleek design, it all started to click. In January 2007, after several years of feverish work, Steve stood on stage at the Macworld conference in San Francisco and introduced the world to the product of their labor. Every once in a while, a revolutionary product comes along that changes everything, he began, and the audience fell utterly silent, sensing history in the making. Steve announced 3 products: a widescreen iPod with touch controls, a revolutionary mobile phone, and a breakthrough internet communications device. Then he famously revealed that these were not 3 separate devices, but one device, the iPhone. Gasps, then cheers erupted as he held up that slick black device with its brilliant touchscreen. It had no physical keyboard, just a smooth glass front, a radical departure from every smartphone at the time. Steve demonstrated how easily you could scroll through songs with a flick of a finger, pinch to zoom in on photos, and browse the real internet on a phone. People in the audience were smiling and shaking their heads in disbelief at the elegance of it all. Some even laughed out loud with delight, as if they had witnessed a bit of real-world magic. Watching from the stage as the crowd leapt to its feet in a standing ovation, Steve felt a wave of emotion swell in him. In that shining moment, he could almost see the entire arc of his journey: the garage with Woz, the triumph of the early Apple years, the crushing blow of being fired, the wilderness years of doubt and perseverance, the long fight back to the top. It all crystallized in the reflection of that glossy iPhone screen. It was overwhelming and beautiful. Those who knew Steve well could see a glint of tears in his eyes as he beamed with pride. The iPhone went on sale later that year, and the world would never be the same. It set off a revolution in how we communicate, work, and live, essentially launching the era of the modern smartphone and putting Apple once again at the forefront of technology and culture. And Apple wasn't done. A few years later, under Steve's leadership, it would introduce the iPad, kicking off the tablet computing revolution and further solidifying Apple's place as a leader in innovation. The iPhone's launch triggered a fundamental shift in the landscape. On launch day in June 2007, lines snaked around entire city blocks at Apple stores, with people camping overnight and cheering as they finally got their hands on the device that had lived in their dreams since that January keynote. Scenes of jubilation played out at stores worldwide. It was hard to fathom. This was the same company that, 10 years prior, people thought might not live to see another year. Now Apple products were so coveted that strangers high-fived each other in line and celebrated as if it were a concert or a sporting event. Under Steve's guidance, the company that had once been dismissed as doomed had transformed into an industry leader, a synonym for innovation and excellence. In fact, within a decade of his return, Apple's market value surpassed that of all its tech rivals, including the mighty Microsoft. The underdog had become the champion, and the world was taking notice. Apple stores were suddenly filled with excited fans. New product launches became global happenings. Apple didn't just come back from the dead, it soared higher than it ever had before. The employees who had once whispered fears of bankruptcy were now bursting with pride. They were part of something that would go down in history, the greatest turnaround in Silicon Valley, maybe in all of business. And Steve? He had become more than just the co-founder who returned. He became a living legend, a symbol of creativity, resilience, and the power of second chances. People who had once dismissed him as a has-been were now in awe, marveling at the vision and tenacity it took to orchestrate such an epic resurrection. The same publications that doubted Apple's survival a decade earlier were naming Steve CEO of the Year, and putting his picture on their covers with headlines like, "Steve's Job, Complete." The dark chapter when Apple nearly died was not only over, it had become legend, a tale of redemption retold in business schools and startup garages for inspiration. Steve's personal transformation was just as remarkable as Apple's. The brash, impulsive young man who had been ousted in 1985 had evolved into a wiser, more mature leader. He still had his intense passion and his exacting standards. That's who he was, and that's part of what made Apple great, but he had learned to focus that energy, to prioritize, and to collaborate in ways he might not have before. He learned to trust talented colleagues, like Johnny Ive, the designer behind the iMac and iPhone, whom Steve empowered and partnered with, and he learned to say no to thousands of distractions so he could say yes to the right ideas. Failure had also taught Steve humility. He knew what it was like to lose everything, and that made him more appreciative of what came after. As he famously said later, getting fired from Apple was the best thing that could have ever happened to him. It was awful tasting medicine, he said, but I guess the patient needed it. That failure taught him lessons that success never could. It made him more humble, more hungry, and it set him on a path that would eventually bring him and Apple to greater heights than ever. Life had a way of coming full circle. The very thing that nearly destroyed him became the catalyst for his greatest triumph. Steve later likened it to connecting dots. You can't connect the dots looking forward, you can only connect them looking backward, he told an audience of graduates years later, reflecting on that tumultuous time. In hindsight, he saw that each dot in his journey, getting pushed out of Apple, founding Next, discovering the potential of Pixar, all connected to pave the way for Apple's rebirth. At the time, each event felt random and unbearably painful, but looking back years later, he could see they all happened for a reason. Steve's story and Apple's story is a testament to the power of vision and the indomitable spirit of never giving up. Just when the night is darkest, the dawn is nearest. Just when you think all is lost, a spark inside can ignite and light the whole world. Apple's rise from the ashes proved that no matter how dire things look, with passion, creativity, and relentless perseverance, anything is possible. Steve once told the world to think different, and by his own life he showed what that meant, to see possibility where others see only failure, to refuse to accept the end when you still have something worth fighting for. Apple didn't just survive, it changed the world all over again. And Steve Jobs, the man who had once been forced out in disgrace, returned to become one of the greatest comeback stories in modern history. His journey was a classic hero's odyssey, a roller coaster of soaring highs and crushing lows. He left home, lost everything, faced the demons of failure, and then returned home triumphant. He wouldn't have had it any other way. Through it all, he discovered that our greatest successes often arise from our most painful failures. This saga leaves us with a lesson that resonates far beyond business or technology. It's about life, about the human spirit. It's about having the courage to follow your heart and the resilience to pick yourself up when you fall. Sometimes life is going to hit you in the head with a brick. Don't lose faith. In our darkest moments, we must remember not to give up, because the story isn't over as long as we have the will to keep writing it. Maybe you've been knocked down, told you're not good enough, or seen your dream almost slip away. If Steve's journey proves anything, it's that no setback is the end unless you allow it to be. The light can always return, brighter than ever. No matter what you're going through, you have the strength to overcome it and redefine your story. As the sun began to set on one of his final days at Apple, Steve stood by his office window and looked out over the campus. The sky was painted orange and pink, casting a warm glow on the buildings where lights were still on and employees buzzed with late-evening energy. He saw the Apple logo adorning the entrance, lit up and gleaming. Once, that logo had seemed to him a sad reminder of a dream that might have died, but now it stood as a symbol of hope and limitless creativity. Down below, groups of employees huddled around desks, working passionately on the next innovations. He smiled, feeling a deep sense of peace and fulfillment. Apple was alive, bursting with ideas and energy. Even if one day he would no longer be there, Steve knew the spark he had reignited would continue to burn brightly in the people of Apple. In saving Apple, Steve had also saved something in himself, the belief that one person, with enough passion and perseverance, truly can change the world even if they have to walk through fire and darkness to do it. Here's to the crazy ones, the misfits, the rebels, the troublemakers, the round pegs in the square holes. The ones who see things differently. They are not fond of rules, and they have no respect for the status quo. You can quote them, disagree with them, glorify or vilify them. About the only thing you can't do is ignore them, because they change things. They push the human race forward. And while some may see them as crazy, we see genius. Because the people who are crazy enough to think they can change the world are the ones who do.